discretion advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
"36-year-old professional football player Steve McNair enjoyed a successful and lucrative career in the NFL. The Houston Oilers drafted him 3rd overall in 1995, and 2 years later he was named their regular starting quarterback when the team moved to Nashville and was renamed to the Tennessee Titans. He was given the nickname Air McNair and played a total of 13 seasons in the NFL, 11 for the Titans and 2 more with the Baltimore Ravens, before he announced his retirement from football in 2007. At the time of his retirement, Steve had been married to his wife, Michelle, for a decade, and the two of them had 2 sons together. "It's been a great ride," he said after his last game. "It's a sad, emotional day for me. I'm trying to do the best I can to hold it in, but at the same time, I'm opening up a lot more doors for the future. I can become, now, the father I need to be to my kids." However, Steve struggled to cope with moving away from the fame and the sense of purpose that professional football had given him. So many pro athletes focus on sports so much from the time they were kids until the time they retire, that once they do retire, they can struggle to fit into the real world. One of his former teammates later told the media, quote, "What people fail to realize is that when you make a transition away from the game, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, you go through something. You change, and you're constantly searching for something." Steve never got the chance to adjust to his retirement. Only 2 years later, on the 4th of July, Steve's dead body was found in the Nashville condo he rented. He had been shot to death, but he wasn't alone. Lying next to him, there was another dead body belonging to 20-year-old Sahel Kazemi. Sahel, who went by the nickname Jenny, had lived a difficult life. When she was 9 years old, her mother had been violently murdered. As a teenager, she and her family fled their home country of Iran and moved to Florida. Jenny moved away from her family, the only source of support in her life, to Nashville to live with her 20-year-old boyfriend, Keith Norfleet. At the time, Jenny was only 16 years old. In 2009, Jenny and Keith had recently broken up, but she was still living in Nashville, working as a waitress in a chain restaurant that Steve McNair often visited. It was Dave & Buster's at Opry Mills, in case you were wondering. She had become familiar with Steve because he was such a frequent customer and always made an effort to talk to the staff there. Quote, "He was one of the nice guys who would talk to you," another coworker at the restaurant said, "not like the other athletes." Jenny developed romantic feelings for Steve and ended up giving him her cell phone number. Despite having a wife and a family, Steve started texting Jenny and taking her on expensive dates. The nature of their relationship made their different lifestyles obvious. Jenny was a 19-year-old who worked a minimum wage job, and Steve was a famous athlete in his 30s who owned multiple properties and businesses. He took Jenny with him on luxurious vacations, and when she turned 20, he bought her a new car, a Cadillac Escalade. Jenny was naturally excited to tell her family back in Florida that one day she and Steve would get married and buy a house together. While Jenny was smitten with Steve, her family didn't feel the same way. They were skeptical. None of her family members were fans of the NFL, so they weren't impressed with Steve's name, career, or status. Mostly they were concerned about the fact that Steve was married with a family of his own and didn't seem to plan on leaving his wife for Jenny. Steve's lack of commitment wasn't the only source of stress in Jenny's life. When Steve had gifted her the Cadillac, I'm using air quotes on gifted, he also arranged for her to make monthly payments on the car, which was in both of their names. Jenny still hadn't sold her own car, and the costs kept piling up. Side note, if you give someone a gift and that gift is a huge car payment, are you really giving them a gift? Anyway, She had been living in an apartment with a roommate, splitting the $1,000 monthly rent between the two of them. But then the roommate moved out, leaving Jenny struggling to pay the whole sum herself. On the day that he died, Steve received a text from Jenny asking if he loved her, to which he responded, "I love you, baby." During that same conversation, Jenny confessed to Steve that she was stressed about money and couldn't afford paying for her cell phone bill. Steve responded by transferring Jenny a total of $2,000 and then went to visit her to check if she was okay. Despite Steve seeming to go out of his way to take care of Jenny, their relationship had not been easy. Throughout their affair, Steve had been struggling to keep Jenny a secret from his wife, Michelle. Jenny wanted to be in a serious, monogamous relationship with Steve, but he didn't feel the same way. In fact, she wasn't the only woman he was having an affair with. Jenny found used condoms in Steve's bedroom and started to stalk the other woman that she believed he was seeing. As she became more and more pushy, repeatedly calling Steve when he was spending time with his family, Steve became distant. He tried to pull back from the relationship, but he never stopped seeing her entirely. Only 2 days before Steve and Jenny died, Jenny had been pulled over by the Nashville police and arrested for drunk driving. She was driving a black Cadillac, the car that Steve bought for her 20th birthday, and Steve was sitting in the passenger seat. As the officers arrested Jenny and escorted her to the police car, Jenny repeatedly begged for Steve to come to the police car to speak with her. However, Steve wasn't under arrest, so instead of talking to Jenny, he called a taxi and left the scene. Later that day, he paid Jenny's bail, and immediately after she was released from jail, she went to buy a gun. Investigators were left with 2 dead bodies, and no survivors to immediately tell them who had pulled the trigger and why. The murder weapon, a 9mm gun, was found underneath Jenny Kazemi's body, and forensic testing found gunpowder residue on the fingers and palm of her left hand. Unlike Jenny, who had been shot in the head at close range, Steve had been shot 3 times from a distance of more than 3 feet away, as well as one final shot at point-blank range. Because of the positioning of his body and the gunshot wounds, Steve was believed to have been asleep when he was killed. The forensic evidence allowed the police to reach a conclusion. The deaths were a murder-suicide, where Jenny shot Steve to death and then sat down on the couch next to his body and committed suicide with the same gun. It appeared that she sat next to him and hoped that she would fall sideways and die lying in his lap, but instead, she had fallen to the floor. The investigation into the case was studied by retired FBI Greg McNair, who had more than 10 years' experience working in the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit. Greg came to the same conclusion as the police, that Jenny killed Steve because of stress that came from their relationship and her financial situation. Greg didn't believe that Steve's murder had been spontaneous. From Jenny's cell phone records and her decision to buy a gun, it appeared that she had decided that she was going to kill Steve before she met up with him that night. She had also shot him a total of 4 times, even though every one of the wounds would have been fatal on its own. Quote, "To me, shooting him more than once is kind of that revenge thing. We have something like this when we deal with overkill. There's more emotion. It's more effective, more rage, more getting even. Whatever that motive may be." She hadn't just wanted to hurt Steve, she had shot him repeatedly, beginning when he was asleep on the couch, because she was determined to end his life. The rest of the crime scene details supported Greg McNair's belief that the murder had been an act of revenge and possession. "This certainly looks like an attempt at posing," he said, agreeing that Jenny had planned on dying in Steve's lap. Quote, "She's dressed up in all this pink, which is very feminine, and trying to have her body on his. It's as though it's a symbolic kind of possession." The day before she killed Steve, Jenny had talked with a friend about the stress in her life. Quote, "I should just end it." That is 10 Minute Murder for today. brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, that's my name. I'm the host, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to my podcast today. If you're new to listening to 10 Minute Murder, welcome. Make sure you catch up on all the back episodes and get ready for the new one that is coming up next. If this is a binge listen and you're on to the next one, you can go right along to it. Or if you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, the next episode of 10 Minute Murder, I'm going to tell you about 3 members of a wealthy family who were shot to death by a calculated, careful killer. Only the youngest child of the family, 21-year-old Dana Ewell, survived. Was he behind the murders of his own family? You'll find out in the next episode of 10 Minute Murder. So make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now and connect with 10 Minute Murder on social media. See the pictures of what we talk about here on the podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, this episode, or the whole thing in general, make sure you leave a 5-star review any place that's possible. It helps the show grow, helps more people find 10 Minute Murder, and the more the show grows, the more time I have to put into episodes, and it makes the podcast better all around. So please do that. For all things related to 10 Minute Murder, you can go to 10minutemurder.com. That's it. Thank you for listening to another 10 Minute Murder podcast episode. I'll see you on the next one.